This team was supposed to end the joke. For years, the Toronto Maple Leafs were the punchline. Big market, money, endless coverage, and not much to show for it. Then the kids showed up, and the city started dreaming again. Austin Matthews looked like the franchise center they had chased forever. Mitch Marner felt like the hometown playmaker out of a dream. William Nylander had silky mitts and the kind of skill that made every touch feel dangerous. John Tavares came later and made it all feel serious. Toronto finally had the sort of roster people build in Chell. Then spring kept showing up, and every spring, the same feeling drifted over the city. Nervous before puck drop, sick by the handshake line. By the time the 2025 to 2026 season went sideways, people were no longer asking how close the Leafs were. They were asking whether the whole thing had already come and gone. To get there, you have to rewind to when this franchise looked tired, clumsy, and out of ideas. Before Matthews, before Marner, before Nylander, the Leafs spent years acting like they were closer than they really were. In 2013, they blew that Game 7 against Boston after leading 4-1 in the third. Everyone knows the clip, and everybody in Toronto can feel the panic building before the tying Gino even arrives. That collapse stuck around. It sat in the walls of the barn, and every bad playoff moment after that dragged it back into the room. By 2014 to 2015, the team looked rotten. They finished 30, 44, and 8. From January 1st on, they went 6, 26, and 3. The effort looked bad, and the body language looked worse. Fans stopped seeing a rough patch and started seeing something emptier than that. There was no real direction, and even the building felt different once the sellout streak snapped. In Toronto, that's a warning sign. Brendan Shanahan had come in to fix the organization, and eventually the front office stopped pretending a patch job would do. They stripped it down, veterans were moved, and picks mattered again. The roster got worse on purpose. In a market like Toronto, where patience lasts about 5 minutes, that took guts, or maybe desperation, probably both. The 2015 to 2016 Leafs finished last with 69 points. The hockey was ugly, and the nights blurred together. But everybody understood what the season was really about. Lottery odds. One top pick. One clean shot at a superstar. Then the bounce went their way. Toronto won the 2016 lottery and landed the first overall selection for the first time in 31 years. Austin Matthews was there. Big center, heavy shot, calm face. The kind of prospect who changes a franchise before he even plays a game. William Nylander came in 2014 and brought pure offense. Mitch Marner followed in 2015 and looked like he saw the ice from somewhere above it. Toronto leaned hard into skill. They wanted talent, pace, and players who could tilt the rink. Matthews completed the picture. Suddenly, the Leafs had a path, and for the first time in a while, it made sense. In 2016 to 2017, Toronto jumped from dead last to the playoffs. Matthews scored 40 goals as a rookie. Marner looked fearless. Nylander looked ready right away. Morgan Rielly fit neatly with the new timeline. The team was young, quick, and loose in a way Leafs fans had not seen in years. They lost to Washington in 6 games, but nobody left that series feeling embarrassed. It felt like an arrival. From 2016 to 2017 through 2024 to 2025, the Leafs piled up wins. 6 100-point seasons in 9 years. They hit 115 points in 2021 to 2022 and put up 108 in 2024 to 2025. Matthews turned into one of the best scorers in hockey. Marner became one of the best playmakers in the league. Nylander grew from flashy winger into a real star. Year after year, Toronto iced dangerous teams with speed, apples, and enough skill to scare anybody in the conference. Then, they made the move that told everyone this was supposed to be the window. John Tavares signed on July 1st, 2018. 7 years, $77 million. Hometown player. Former first overall pick. Big center. Big name. Toronto signed him because they thought the roster was ready to win right then. Once Tavares arrived, people started calling them the Core Four. Matthews, Marner, Nylander, and Tavares ate a massive share of the salary cap. That became the bet. Spend huge money on elite forwards and figure out the rest later. For stretches, the gamble looked brilliant. The Leafs could drown teams in skill and win 50-plus games while making it look normal. Then the playoffs would start, and the ice always seemed to get smaller around them. Boston beat them in 7 in 2018. Boston beat them in 7 again in 2019. Columbus got them in the 2020 bubble. Montreal came next, and that one never left. Toronto went up 3-1 in the series in 2021 and still lost. 3 straight losses. Game 7 at home. The same old feeling settling in before the final horn. You could feel the air leave the place. Before Montreal, there was still some innocence around the failures. Tough draws, bad bounces, learning curve. After Montreal, that got harder to sell. The Leafs had the better roster. They had the series, and they had the chance. Then they tightened up and let it slip. Fans stopped arguing over whether the group was talented enough because they already knew it was. The new argument was uglier. Did this team have the nerve for it? Toronto lost another Game 7 to Tampa Bay in 2022. In 2023, they finally beat the Lightning in 6, with John Tavares scoring the overtime winner. The reaction in the city was almost weird. Relief more than joy. Then, Florida beat them in 5 in the second round, and the old mood came rushing back. In 2024, it was Boston again. This time in overtime in Game 7. In 2025, they got through Ottawa, then lost to Florida in 7, with Game 7 turning into a 6-1 wreck. At some point, the details blurred. The feeling never did. And through all of this, Mitch Marner became the lightning rod. That part was always a little messy. Marner was brilliant in the regular season. He drove offense, killed penalties, created chances out of nothing, and in 2024 to 2025 put up 102 points, the best total of his career. He also carried the burden of an ugly contract negotiation from earlier in the era, and in Toronto, people remember that stuff forever. Once the playoff losses stacked up, every quiet night landed harder on him. One turnover would loop for days. One awkward quote would become a week of radio. By the summer of 2025, the relationship looked cooked. Auston Matthews was not going anywhere. Nylander had already been extended. Tavares was older and harder to move. Marner sat in the center of every trade conversation, fair or unfair. On July 1st, 2025, Toronto signed him to an 8-year extension and immediately sent him to Vegas in a sign and trade. The kid was out. Years of tension finally had an ending. Craig Berube had taken over behind the bench after Sheldon Keefe was fired. The idea made sense. Berube had authority, edge, and a Stanley Cup. Maybe the Leafs needed a harder voice. Maybe they needed someone who would sand down the loose parts and make them heavier for spring. Marner was gone. The roster looked thinner. The defense never felt secure. The goaltending gave too much away. Toronto spent most of the season wobbling around the playoff line instead of looking like a contender. By March, the numbers were plain. Too many goals against, negative goal differential, too much strain on the scorers, not enough push from the rest of the lineup. A knee-on-knee collision with Radko Gudas left Matthews with a grade 3 MCL tear. His season was over. That was the final blow. He already had been having a strange year by his standards, just slightly off. Fewer goals, less takeover. Then the injury hit, and whatever thin hope the Leafs still had went with him. Because this team was no longer one bounce away or one adjustment away. The exits had piled up. Marner was gone. Matthews was hurt. Tavares was older. The Caps still had scars from the old build. Toronto was looking at the remains of the plan that was supposed to drag them into a new age. The painful part is that the era was not fake. Matthews really did become a franchise player. Marner really was elite for long stretches. Nylander really did blossom into a top star. Tavares gave them goals and that one overtime winner that at least cracked open the door for a moment. This group gave Toronto relevance. It gave the city huge nights, huge numbers, and the feeling that maybe this time the script would finally bend. It never did. The weird losses did not help either. In 2020, David Aries, a 42-year-old emergency goalie and Zamboni driver connected to Toronto's AHL system, came into a game for Carolina and beat the Leafs in their own arena. You could not write a crueler Leafs headline if you sat down and tried. That is part of their modern story too. Even when they were good, they kept stumbling in moments that made the whole league laugh. So, what comes next? A total teardown feels unlikely. Matthews and Nylander are still too good, and Toronto is too rich and too restless to bottom out on purpose again. The more realistic move is a hard retool. Build around Matthews and Nylander, see how much Matthew Nyes and Easton Cowan can give, spend cap space with more care, add help on defense, find steadier goaltending. Build a roster that does not need the top forwards to solve every problem every night. That sounds obvious. Doing it in Toronto is another story. This market turns every season into a referendum. Every slump gets picked apart. Every contract gets dragged into the light. Every playoff game carries half a century of baggage. That pressure does not excuse the failures, but it sure does make them louder. And now the organization has to answer the question it spent years trying to avoid. Or was it flawed from the start in ways everyone kept trying not to see? That is why this era hurts. Toronto drafted well, developed stars, signed the biggest free agent on the market, and built a team that looked loaded for years. Then, the losses kept stacking in the worst possible moments until the story changed shape entirely. Now, when people think about this version of the Leafs, they're not going to start with the regular season numbers. They're going to remember the tension, the blown chances, the tight sticks in Game 7, and the feeling in the crowd when everybody could sense trouble coming before it fully arrived. For almost a decade, Toronto had enough talent to make the Stanley Cup feel close enough to touch. They never got there. And that is the rise and fall of the Leafs' core era. A rebuild that worked, a contender that won a ton, a market that believed every fall a spring collapse waiting around the corner. By the end, the promise was still visible, and so was the damage. The names were huge. The results, when it mattered most, never matched them. That is what hangs over the franchise now. Everybody knows those players were good. The real question is whether Toronto has the stomach to admit what this era actually was and build the next one differently.